Welcome, dear listeners, to a journey into the hidden engine that drives our world, the debt machine. I am Zayd Haji, author, research student, and founder of IFR, ISR, and IGC. My life's work is to uncover the traps that keep individuals, nations, and generations chained, and to show the path back to justice through the timeless principles of Islamic finance. Today, we will step behind the curtain of global economics, where numbers tell one story, but morality tells another, and together they reveal a cycle that has repeated for centuries. This is not just history. This is the pattern shaping your future right now. In the world of economics, two seemingly different voices have described the same hidden storm. Ray Dalio in How Countries Go Broke, The Big Cycle, traces the rise and fall of nations through cold, precise patterns of debt and power. Zayd Haji in The Invisible Debt Trap peels back the same system's skin to reveal its moral and spiritual decay, naming riba as its poison and divine law as its cure. One speaks in the language of global finance, the other in the voice of eternal principles, yet together they tell a single, urgent story about the cycles that lift and destroy nations. Stay with me until the end, because the last words you hear today might just change the way you see money, debt, and your own future forever. The story of the debt machine and the big cycle. Picture an economy as a great machine, a machine powered by human desires, by trust, and above all by debt. At first, the machine hums with energy. People borrow, they spend, incomes rise, asset prices climb. It feels like progress, it feels unstoppable. But the story always turns. At some point, debt repayments begin to grow faster than incomes. Families, businesses, and governments find themselves tightening their belts. One person's reduced spending means another person's reduced income. Incomes fall, creditworthiness erodes, and lenders step back. Borrowing slows, yet the weight of debt remains. Repayments keep climbing, spending drops further, and the cycle reverses on itself. This is the long-term debt peak. We saw this in 2008. It was the same story in Japan in 1989. And in America in 1929. The plot never changes, only the cast does. The economy begins deleveraging. People cut spending, income shrink, credit vanishes, asset prices collapse. Banks strain under the pressure, stock markets crash, and social tensions simmer into open unrest. Borrowers, now squeezed, sell assets to make ends meet, but when everyone sells at once, prices free fall. Real estate tanks, collateral loses value, and borrowers appear even less creditworthy. Credit disappears almost entirely. Less spending, less income, less wealth, less credit, a vicious spiral downward. A recession feels similar, but here is the difference. In a normal recession, lowering interest rates can breathe life back into the system. In a deleveraging, rates are already near zero. The usual cure no longer works. In the 1930s and again in 2008, US rates hit 0% and stayed there. Lenders and borrowers alike lose faith. Lenders realize debts can never be fully repaid. Borrowers know they can't repay and no longer want to take on more. The economy itself becomes like an individual with ruined credit, and so the question becomes, what can be done? History tells us there are only four ways out. 1. People, businesses, and governments cut spending. 2. Debts are reduced through defaults and restructurings. 3. Wealth is redistributed from the haves to the have-nots. 4. The central bank prints new money. Every modern deleveraging has used some mix of these four. But these long-term peaks don't come from nowhere. They grow from countless short-term debt cycles, expansions, and contractions that typically last 5-8 years. It begins when spending, fueled by instantly created credit, outpaces the production of goods. Prices rise, inflation. The central bank, fearing too much inflation, raises interest rates. Borrowing slows, debt payments rise, spending falls, incomes drop, and prices begin to fall, deflation. If the downturn becomes too deep, the central bank lowers rates again, repayments ease, borrowing resumes, and expansion returns. Stay with me until the end, because the last words you hear today might just change the way you see money, debt, and your own future forever. Over decades, these short-term cycles stack, but with each one, debt grows a little faster than income. Human nature pushes people to borrow and spend rather than repay. Lenders, confident in good times, extend credit freely. Rising incomes and asset values mask the growing burden until the mask slips. At some point, repayments outpace incomes. The peak arrives, the reversal begins. Sometimes the turning point comes from a shock, like in 1971 when the United States, still under the gold standard, ran out of real money. Paper dollars like checks promised gold in exchange. But America had been spending far more than it earned, writing far more paper than it had gold to back. As foreign holders rushed to exchange their dollars for gold, the U.S. reserves dwindled. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon went on television to temporarily suspend convertibility. In truth, it was a default. The link between money and gold was severed. Strangely, the stock market soared afterward, just as it had in 1933 when Roosevelt did the same. In both cases, breaking the link allowed the government to spend beyond its means simply by printing more dollars. These moments fit into what I call the big cycle. It begins with the establishment of a new order, political, economic, and monetary, usually born out of war and turmoil. The last began in 1945 after World War II. Inside it are shorter economic cycles. When debts rise faster than incomes, when political polarization deepens, when a rising power challenges the leading one, the cycle nears its end. The old order cracks, a new one waits in the wings. The rise of great powers carries its own seeds of decline. As nations grow rich, their workers grow expensive and less competitive. Others copy their technologies. Wealth brings leisure, decadence, and weaker resolve. Values shift from the grit of the first generation to the complacency of the next. Wealth gaps widen as the rich entrench their advantage. Resentment builds among the poor, but as long as living standards rise for most, the system holds. When that rise stops, conflict erupts. Holding the world's reserve currency gives immense power, but it also tempts a nation to borrow excessively. That borrowing sustains influence beyond fundamentals, financing both domestic overspending and costly international commitments. In the short term, it makes the empire appear strong. In the long term, it weakens it. Stay with me until the end, because the last words you hear today might just change the way you see money, debt, and your own future forever. In recent years, three forces have returned together for the first time in living memory. Nations drowning in debt even after rates hit zero, forcing central banks to print unprecedented amounts of money. Deep internal divisions driven by wealth and value gaps fueling populism and polarization. Rising external conflict between a rising great power, China, and the current one, the United States. The last time these converged was 1930-1945. Then as now, internal and world orders were rewritten. The American world order, born in 1945 and underpinned by the dollar as the global reserve currency, has lasted nearly 80 years. History says such orders always change. And now the same timeless, universal forces are at work. The machine running its course, the cycle turning again. The question is not whether change will come. The question is whether we will see it before it arrives. Every great financial crisis is more than a mathematical inevitability, it is a moral reckoning. Behind the charts, the credit lines, and the boom and bust curves lie human choices, ethical compromises, and values quietly traded away for short-term gain. To speak of debt cycles without speaking of the principles that either restrain or unleash them is tell only half the truth. Economics may describe the what and how, but ethics confronts the why. Ignore one and the other will always lead to the same end: wealth without justice, growth without foundation, and collapse without warning. Stay with me until the end, because the last words you hear today might just change the way you see money, debt, and your own future forever. Two men from different worlds and driven by different convictions have looked into the same economic abyss and described it in hauntingly similar terms. Ray Dalio in How Countries Go Broke. The big cycle maps the rise and fall of nations through the cold precision of cycles, numbers, and history. Zayd Haji in the Invisible Debt Trap book peers into that same machinery but strips away its facade, revealing the moral and spiritual corrosion beneath, naming the poison as riba and tracing the chain back to its divine prohibition. One story speaks in the language of global finance, the other in the voice of eternal law, yet together they form a single, unbroken narrative. Dalio tells us how the machine runs until it breaks. Haji tells us why it was built to break in the first place, and the only way to escape its grip. Read separately, each is compelling. Read together, they do more. They demand a reckoning, forcing the mind to see that the economic storms of history are not random, but the predictable outcome of moral choices repeated over centuries. Now, let us connect dots to follow the thread from the great cycles of history into the heart of the invisible debt trap, where the hidden architecture of our financial world is exposed and the way back to justice, stability, and divine alignment is revealed. The forgotten law of wealth. Imagine a man standing on the shore, watching the tide. At first, the waters swell and rise, carrying ships higher and higher. Traders rejoice, merchants grow rich, and kings believe the tide will never fall. But in the unseen depths, the pull has already begun. The same force that lifts will soon drag back, harder than anyone expects. This is how debt works in the modern world. It grows quietly at first, a tool for opportunity, but then it swells beyond control, repayments climbing faster than incomes, until the weight crushes both debtor and creditor. The Quran warns of this imbalance, for it breeds injustice on both sides, the borrower chained, the lender tempted to exploit. In Islam, debt is never meant to be a permanent feature of life. It is a bridge to necessity, not a home to live in forever. But humanity has turned it into a fortress, one that eventually collapses upon its builders. Stay with me until the end, because the last words you hear today might just change the way you see money, debt, and your own future forever. At the heart of this fortress lies a poison, riba. The Quran does not speak softly here. It says those who persist in it stand in open war with Allah and His Messenger. And riba behaves exactly as the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, warned. It swells without limit. Even as incomes shrink, the obligation remains, like a fire that cannot be extinguished. In Islam, money must serve trade, partnership, and real value, not the endless compounding of someone else's gain. That is why the divine law replaces interest with profit and loss sharing, with partnerships rooted in tangible assets, mudaraba, musharaka, forms of commerce that grow wealth without growing chains. But the modern system has gone further astray. It creates credit out of thin air, inflating numbers in ledgers as if they were real riches. Islam demands money be anchored to truth, to gold, silver, or goods of genuine value. This was the way of the gold dinar and silver dirham, the standard of trust. In 1971, when the US severed its link between the dollar and gold, it untied the ship from the shore. From that moment, the tide could be swelled by nothing more than ink and paper, or in our age, a keystroke. Inflation became a hidden tax, draining wealth from the unaware. And so the cycle continues. Wealth pulls at the top as if gravity itself is rigged. Resentment brews below. Islam's system has safeguards for this. Zakat to keep wealth flowing, the prohibition of hoarding to keep resources alive in the economy, inheritance laws to stop the grip of dynasties. The Quran warns those who hoard gold and silver and do not spend it in the way of Allah that such hoards will be heat in hell and branded upon their owners. This is not mere poetry, it is economic justice written in fire. Stay with me until the end, because the last words you hear today might just change the way you see money, debt, and your own future forever. History shows there are only 4 ways out when debt burdens break a nation: cutting spending, defaulting or restructuring debts, redistributing wealth, or printing more money. The Islamic way would make such a moment unnecessary. By eliminating riba, grounding currency in real assets, limiting debt to genuine needs, and ensuring zakat and inheritance circulate wealth, the tide would rise and fall naturally without drowning the shore. And here lies the greater truth. The rise and fall of empires follows the same law. No nation holds the peak forever. Decline begins when the powerful grow corrupt, when greed overtakes justice, when luxury softens resolve. The Quran speaks of cities destroyed after their elites were commanded to obey, yet they defied and the decree became inevitable. The decadence, the widening gaps, the injustice you see today are not accidents. They are the first cracks in the pillars of great powers. Islam's economic order is not merely a set of rules. It is a shield against the very cycles that bring nations to their knees. Every empire that has ignored these laws has met the same fate. The tide that carried them up returned to drag them under. And so the question is not whether the fall will come. The question is whether we will stand on the shore pretending the tide is still rising, or step back to the solid ground of divine law before the waters claim us. Read separately, Dalio cycles and Haji's insights illuminate two halves of the same truth, that economic collapse is never just numbers, but the result of moral choices repeated until the system breaks. Read together, they demand a reckoning to see that without the ethics and safeguards embedded in divine law, every debt machine will run until it destroys itself. The bridge between these two works is not just academic, it is a roadmap to step off the track before the next cycle completes and the tide drags us under. Now, dear listener, dear traveler on this uneven road, if these words have unsettled you even by a breath, then let that stirring not dissolve into silence. The debt machine will not wait, the tide will not pause, and the next cycle is already cresting. Arm yourself not with noise, but with knowledge. These are not books you borrow and return to gather dust in another's shelf. These are compasses you keep, maps you pass to your children, warnings you etch into memory. How countries go broke. The big cycle will show you the patterns, the machinery, the rhythm of rise and ruin. The invisible debt trap will strip away the disguise, expose the poison of riba, and lay bare the only principles that can break the cycle. Own them, read them, live by their lessons. The ebooks are ready for you now on Google Play Books and Amazon Kindle. Portable truth for wherever you walk. If you prefer the gravity of paper, order the paperback editions from Amazon India or Flipkart and let the ink breathe in your hands. Visit zaydhaji.com or zayedalhaji.com. This is Zayd Haji signing off with faith and praying that the Almighty grants you clarity in truth, strength in justice, and safety from the snares of debt and deception.